Okay, well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, looking at the relationship between observability and monitoring. My name is Helen Owens-Pope. I'm responsible for marketing here at Loop One, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar behind the scenes. Before we get into the main session, I'm just going to quickly run through a few housekeeping items. So today's session is being recorded, and a link will be shared with attendees following today's live broadcast, typically within about 48 hours. All attendees will be muted throughout today's session, but you can submit questions at any time using the Q&A panel in your meeting window. If you experience any technical difficulties, you can drop me a chat message. I think I'm listed as host, and I'll do my best to assist. And finally, please let us know how we did today in the feedback survey at the end. So the survey will pop up in your meeting window as you exit today's webinar. So with that, I will hand you across to today's host, Loop One CEO, Bill Fitzpatrick. Good morning, Bill.
Good morning. Thank you, Helen, and good morning to all of you who have joined. I appreciate you joining. Again, my name is Bill Fitzpatrick. I am the CEO and founder of Loop One, and we are going to talk today about observability. And in particular, we're going to talk about observability from the context of a traditional monitoring perspective, which is what my background is, right? So we're going to talk about it a little bit from where I come from, but I think it's also fair to say it's where a lot of us come from if we're in that SolarWinds sphere. We come from a traditional monitoring background. So let's jump into it here. If this is your first time joining a Loop One webinar, just a little bit about me. I am an accidental CEO, I sometimes refer to myself, because I do have an engineering background. Started my career at Microsoft, and that background is actually pertinent to today's conversation because my first experience in what I really think about when I think about observability came in the late 90s working at Microsoft. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the conversation. I'm also the de facto architect of what we call the Loop One monitoring maturity model. We're going to talk a bit about that today, and it's fun to think about how observability plays into the monitoring maturity model. They certainly complement each other. I am an aspiring triathlete, but I did recently, about a year ago, tore my meniscus in my right knee, and it still doesn't want to cooperate with me. So my triathlon dreams are kind of on pause for the moment. So I want to start this morning with a poll. So bear with me for a moment while I go get this started up. Let's see here. There it is. We'll go get this poll fired up. And just really, this is a chance for me to learn a little bit about who our attendees are so that I can cater this conversation a bit to all of y'all. So we got a few folks answering now, and it looks like we've got some monitoring specialists and then some folks that are not monitoring specialists, and nothing yet in the middle of that range. No observability specialists, no IT managers or directors, nobody identifying themselves as DevOps or SRE. Everybody is checking in as either other or monitoring specialists. We'll give that another few seconds here, and then we'll continue our conversation. So this will be really interesting knowing that so many of you are self-identifying as monitoring specialists. So if you feel like your role doesn't get represented there, feel free to throw a comment into the chat as well about kind of what your role is versus what we've listed there for roles. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and continue. I'll share these poll results with you as well. So you can see pretty much everybody came through as either a monitoring specialist or other. All right, so a little bit about Loop One. If you haven't worked with us before, we are pretty much the world's largest dedicated SolarWinds professional services partner. We do engagements all over the world. We've got offices in North America, Europe, and Asia. And we've got more than 25 SolarWinds certified engineers on staff. And we help clients in a number of different ways, from classroom training through projects and professional services, all the way through fully proactive managed services and hosted Orion solutions. We talk a little bit more about that as we move to the end of our conversation. We also recently announced our newest partnership with a really terrific solution from a group called Runecast that provides audit and compliance capabilities and remediation capabilities for VMware, along with Kubernetes and Amazon and Azure-based workloads. So really terrific solution. If you're interested in hearing more about Runecast, feel free to let us know and we will give you that information. So jumping into the conversation then on monitoring and observability. I would hope that for most of us, observability is not a completely new term, but I do know that for some of you it is. And when I say completely new, what I really mean is from a day-to-day perspective in your role, you don't really think about observability. I've had conversations with a lot of customers, and it's not unusual in talking to our clients to hear them say, well, observability is not really on my radar. I think about an engineer that I knew, actually a director that I knew in one of our large accounts. Going back probably about 4.5 years ago, I watched, he had updated his title on LinkedIn and moved it from a monitoring sort of focus to an observability title. It was something along the lines of observability and tools director or something to that effect. What was interesting is he didn't leave it there. After a few weeks, I noticed he changed it again and he went back to just more of a tools-based title. I think it was director of tools or something to that effect. And that was really an intriguing thing because we're talking about 4 years ago, somebody who was part of a very active and large SolarWinds deployment with a global footprint running 3 instances of Orion. And yet there was sort of that tug towards observability for him in his world. And unfortunately, I never really had a chance to talk to him about that, but it was just an interesting observation that obviously observability was something that was happening in his world to the point where he changed his title on LinkedIn, but then didn't leave it there. So what I see when I look at observability is really the adoption of specialized tools for monitoring cloud-based applications. And the reason I see it that way is I think that when we moved into sort of the cloud-first world that we sort of live in now, that didn't diminish completely our on-prem demand and workload and data centers. Instead, we entered into that hybrid mode, right? Everything became about hybrid IT. And I think we're very much still there. But this concept of observability is one that I think is being embraced increasingly because it covers the context of what we're trying to do in monitoring in a greater way, in a more all-encompassing way. But it can be a little bit confusing because I think where it really originates from doesn't necessarily align to what I think about when I think about traditional monitoring. It's rather incomplete, right? And that's why I think it's more complementary. So not to contradict myself, right? Let's clarify some of this. When we think about traditional monitoring, I'm talking about on-prem, right? And it's driven by hardware-based resources, shared infrastructure. So not just route and switch and firewall, but also our server infrastructure, right? Server hardware. And as we moved into a hyper-converged world of server hardware in the data center, that's changed it once again in the way that footprint manifests itself physically. But the ability to monitor that footprint, has evolved with it. And so we still have sort of what I consider that traditional monitoring need of on-prem. And then when we contrast that with what happens in the cloud, and where I think a lot of this conversation starts to come from, is that you're now really application centric, right? Because especially early on, when you were trying to ensure the availability and performance of applications in a cloud setting, you couldn't see the infrastructure. You didn't have access to the underlying hardware and shared infrastructure that was allowing for that cloud application to run when you're talking about a cloud native application. And so what does that leave you with? Well, it leaves you with application logging, trace files, and really those types of characteristics with a little bit, perhaps, especially at the beginning, right? It's changed over time, but kind of what I refer to as cloud instrumentation, right? What was available to us in terms of being able to look from the outside in when it comes to understanding what's going on in the cloud, right? So the hardware wasn't going to be visible to you, but you still had to ensure, you still have to ensure application performance and availability. And then in the context of observability, it actually gets complicated even a bit further, because now we're going to add in the concept of debugging applications. And for me, that's always something that has fallen outside of a monitoring conversation. And that really takes us back to my time at Microsoft. So this is late 90s, right? It's a very different era, but some of the earliest concepts around how to debug applications were being born at that time. I worked on a team that was responsible for the creation of WMI. I was there when WMI was born. We called it WebM. And through that era, what we knew in terms of application debugging, and for me in particular, was really about operating system debugging. So I was working with the Windows 2000 team, and I would have to set up systems in very specific ways with serial-based connections to debugging consoles that then also had all of the symbols for the debugging processes loaded. And that gave you the ability to not just monitor an operating system, but also then to debug that operating system in the event that some catastrophic event occurred. So it could be anything from just an error in a service where you weren't necessarily needing the full debug capabilities, to a blue screen where you were going to do full, symbols-based debugging using a separate console. And so as we then move forward into this cloud era, we're not talking about operating system debugging, but that concept of having to have information coming from the application in a way that we can see what's happening inside of it to then make decisions about what needs to happen to the code base, right? That's what I'm talking about, application debugging in the cloud. So from a traditional monitoring perspective, again, it's just not something that many of us are faced with day to day. But as our requirement to support cloud applications increases, and specifically when those cloud applications are applications that are developed and delivered by our own organization, then that demand for a tool that can do traditional observability, right? I've been talking about traditional monitoring here as we've gotten started. Now I'm talking about traditional observability. That concept of application support and debugging, right? It becomes more of the mix, more of what we might need from our tools. So you have those, complex cloud environments where you still need to be able to ensure application performance and availability. And I think that's where we start to see more of the APM products that are out there. Then moving into a application debugging context. And those things, sometimes I think that they get blended together when people just say observability and they're talking about a cloud context. So there's a little bit of the background, right? Where things have been in the past and where they're going, where they somewhat are today. So let's go a little bit deeper and talk about kind of how we might compare monitoring and observability, because I don't really see them as being, as I said before, they're not competitive, right? When we talk about monitoring, it's much more long-standing for many more people. It's pre-cloud, you might even say. I'm reminded all the time, right? Cloud, sometimes people like to say, is just other people's hardware, right? But monitoring, in my experience, I think in the experience of most of us, it's a hardware-centric mindset. Somewhere there's a device, whether that's a server or network device, that we need to ensure the health and performance of, right? And that creates the foundation for traditional monitoring and all of the different things that go into that, the protocols, the credentials, and the methodologies for being able to not only look at the health and availability of a piece of hardware that creates our shared infrastructure, but then to be able to look at the performance of that device and be able to trend performance and then be able to forecast performance. That's really where we start to talk about the maturity of monitoring. And so if we compare that then to observability, many of those same characteristics are necessary. And what you'll hear the industry talk about frequently is this idea of metrics, logs, and traces. And this is where I kind of see some debate, quite frankly, about what observability really is. Some of the material that I've been studying, there are organizations that are basically saying, if you think that observability is just metrics, logs, and traces, you don't understand observability. And I really think where they're going with that mindset is they're trying to emphasize the importance of being able to do not just application availability and performance, but also debug, right? And so there's a bit of a settling, I think, that has to come in terms of how the industry is going to use this term observability long term. And what that also introduces is the concept that's relatively new to me. I hadn't really thought of this term before, but I like the term and I think it makes sense. And that is observability in the data center, or data center observability, right? Because if we think about data centers that we manage, so maybe you call it private cloud, or a data center that's managed by your organization, as opposed to public cloud and environments where you don't have visibility to that underlying hardware, right? That starts to draw some of the lines between, as I've been discussing, what is traditional monitoring versus observability. So the other aspect of this sort of industry definition that's up for debate to some extent is, where does metrics fit into that? Because the other thing that you'll hear, sort of what I might call an observability purist, right? If I want to maybe invent a term there, is the metrics component of observability is downplayed. Because what they're trying to say is, to get true observability, and this is not everybody, but there's some voices out there, there's some authors and others that have said, observability is about your capability to basically know anything about the state of your environment, and in a more flexible way, not having to first identify, collect, and then assess information, but rather have telemetry coming out of your applications in such a way that no matter what happens, you have the data you need to make decisions, to be able to inquire about the environment and then make decisions and draw conclusions about what's happening in the environment. And again, for me, this is where it starts to cross and turn more towards application debugging and support, perhaps, than application performance and availability. Because I think that performance and availability, you do need metrics. And those metrics are valuable. So they shouldn't be fully deprecated. But there are voices out there that are kind of deprecating the concept of metrics. And they're saying that metrics is basically, looking at that old, traditional monitoring. It's a bit offensive to me, actually, because they'll sometimes say legacy monitoring. And I'm like, I know people who just installed switches yesterday. Don't tell me that's legacy, right? It's not legacy, it's traditional, right? In terms of the way I see it. So, I get a little bit offended if I hear somebody say legacy monitoring, because I don't really think there is a such thing as legacy monitoring. I think there's just monitoring. And so I'll sometimes say traditional monitoring. And that's going to be metrics based. And that's going to move all the way up into that application stack, not just down at the network layer. Because application metrics are important. You need to know the trends. You need to know that you need to have an ability to do some forecasting. Obviously, we're seeing lots more talk around AI, and a big part of AI these days is intelligent alerting and the baselines that are used to try and drive intelligent alerting through AI. So I don't see monitoring and observability as two different things that you can choose between. I see them as something that we have to be doing both, right? We have to have our traditional monitoring for shared infrastructure that's hardware centric and metrics driven, but intelligent, right? It's got to continue to mature and improve, and it's got to continue to add value to the conversation. As we talk about maturity here in a moment, we'll talk about how we want to add an ability to do data analytics based on our IT tools data. And then it needs to complement and align and correlate really to our observability tools, and tools that are maybe more logs and trace centric, as opposed to just metrics. And so you start to blend those two worlds. So this is a bit of a recap then, right? Talking about what we just covered. So logs and metrics has been, something that we've done for decades, right? And traces are too, but the way that we talk about tracing today in a hybrid IT environment is really more cloud centric. But I mean, I know from personal experience that, applications like Exchange and, IIS and web-based applications, they've been doing traces for decades as well. but there's more maturity now. There's more products available in the marketplace that are specifically there trying to help manage and ingest that trace data. And we probably should stop there for a moment and talk a little bit about what is a trace, right? What's the difference between traces and logs? It really boils down to this. Can you use your traces to do transaction analysis? Or session analysis might be a better way to say it. So a log is going to be something, an event or a log message that could be entered into a system and then consumed by a log management system, or even a SIM, right? A security event management system. Logs are going to be generated for lots of different reasons, and they're not necessarily being generated for the sake of application performance, right? So logs are much more general in nature. Traces are specifically generated for the sake of debugging, supporting, and driving application quality and performance. So a trace is going to have lots and lots of ID data in it, and preferably that trace is going to support the correlation of those IDs through a session. So session IDs, client IDs, anything that you would need as a developer to be able to go and look at what your code is doing in production and then make adjustments to your code in order to deal with either bugs or performance issues that arise. And that then also starts to tie back to the DevOps world and to some extent to a site reliability engineers world, right? These titles are also being used a bit ad hoc, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it because we don't have time today, but not everybody agrees on what a site reliability engineer is. I think there's much more agreement around what a DevOps engineer does than there is around a site reliability engineer. And I've actually been seeing some content online lately where people are challenging whether they've accepted the right position because they got hired as a site reliability engineer. Turned out they were just a frontline application support person, and there was a there's disagreement between what it meant to be an SRE between the employer and the new hire. So traces are intended for a developer to be able to look at individual sessions and make improvements to their code. And in a cloud environment, in a complex cloud environment where you've got distributed storage and distributed business layers and distributed web layers, those traces can be extremely complex to generate and also extremely complex to capture and digest. And depending on how your applications are architected, they can come on a scale of thousands of messages per minute to millions of messages per hour. And so that's the other challenge for observability tools, right? Is to be able to handle the scale of ingested logs and traces that we maybe don't try to do or attempt to do in a traditional monitoring sense. So one of the areas I want to talk about today, but I'm going to be a little bit careful here, is where SolarWinds is going with this messaging, right? So you're going to hear from SolarWinds, as we've been hearing from a partner now, the concept of observability as a service, which is something that's going to really be focused on their cloud offerings. So it's going to encompass things like AppOptics, Loggly, Papertrail, Pingdom, right? All of their SaaS offerings. But we're also hearing from them about observability on-prem. Right. And so this is sort of what I would consider the traditional monitoring, and it's going to be focused around the Orion product set. So again, I want to be careful of not going too deep into this because this is the SolarWinds message that we really need to let them tell their story, and they're working to tell that story now. So we're just seeing over the last couple of months some of this content coming from them. And so this slide actually is a SolarWinds slide. So I'm sharing it on their behalf, so to speak. But this is the evolution that they're wanting to go through with you as an end user. And I really applaud them and I support them in this. I think that this is what we need to be doing to drive the maturity conversation to deliver end user experiences for end user applications, right? So what we're really talking about there is, I don't care what the underlying delivery system looks like. I want to know for a fact that my users are getting the experience that we intend for them. If you're a CTO, CIO, right, executive leader in an organization, you know that you've got millions of dollars dedicated to the delivery of a user experience, whether you're a retailer, whether you're a major university, whether you're a healthcare organization, whatever industry you're in, oil and gas, finance, it doesn't matter. more and more of your user experience, and that can be an internal user, it can be an employee, or it can be a client on the outside, like in the retail experience or the student experience in a university. Those end users are expecting a seamless and generally tablet or phone-based experience for the interaction with your organization, right? And an online experience, a web-based experience. Now, as we know, a lot of that is being delivered in the cloud, but it's not exclusively cloud. There's a lot of it that's still coming from data center. And even when we look at the cloud, it's fundamentally still a data center, right? And so you're going to need to have what SolarWinds is bringing to the market. You're going to need to have an end-to-end monitoring and observability solution. Whether you call it monitoring or whether you call it observability, it's that end-to-end visibility to understand what's happening within each tier of the application delivery, no matter how complicated it is, no matter how distributed it is, that you have the tools in place and the teams in place that can ensure the availability and performance, but then also take that data and do analytics for forecasting and other analytics to drive business decisions. And as observability is really introducing, some application debug and support, right? So we're really broadening the scope of what these tools are expected to do, while at the same time driving the need for those tools to be able to really effectively correlate data on our behalf. Because as we know, it's really difficult to dive into a tool set and have to go into 15 different places to look at what happened in a particular set of sessions or a particular set of user experiences, right? The aggregation of those user experiences and the de-aggregation of those experiences so that you can do analysis and debug and support. So SolarWinds is making this transition. We're going to be hearing lots more from them about observability, and I'm excited for where the direction that they're headed, and we support them in it. And so that kind of brings us to this recap here, right? Observability and monitoring really do go hand in hand, right? It's the idea that you've got the best of breed tools for that end-to-end visibility that we talked about a moment ago, and that can drive automated correlation. Now, one of the things I'm excited about for the on-prem piece of this is we're seeing SolarWinds look at bundling the Orion tools in more effective ways to make it more accessible to end users. So that if you've been using, for example, Network Performance Monitor and Network Configuration Manager and NetFlow and maybe SAM, and that's sort of been your core footprint, you're going to have access to, through some of the new licensing models. And again, I got to be careful here because I don't want to get too far out of my swim lane and let SolarWinds make their own announcements, but there will be some opportunities to own more of the Orion product set, to do it on a subscription basis, and to gain the benefit of the automatic correlation that SolarWinds has been doing for years. SolarWinds has a feature within the Orion suite called AppStack. And if you've not heard of AppStack before, it's basically when you own the right combination of SolarWinds tools, the platform automatically correlates storage, database, server, application, web transaction, and a series of different types of data points across those to help you automatically correlate and understand what's happening in your environment. So making that more accessible to more clients, to me, is a great idea. So how we take that back and make that a part of a maturity conversation is what we'll talk about next as we move into the final portion of our webinar this morning. We'll talk about what we're doing here at Loop One to drive maturity with our clients through what we call the Loop One monitoring maturity model. And as you heard me talk about through the first half hour of our session here, observability is integral to that, right? It's not in the name, right? It's the monitoring maturity model. But for me, monitoring and observability are oftentimes interchangeable, and it just comes down to, what you're going to do at the application layer, and in particular for application tracing, where it starts to maybe move into its own discipline beyond what we might consider monitoring. What we've done at Loop One is really just stand on the shoulder of giants, right? I don't think there's anybody in the session today that hasn't heard people talk about people, process, and tools, right? That is the long-standing sort of triumvirate of components that we're just trying to bring together in optimal ways to achieve our outcomes. So within that, at Loop One, we're really trying to help bring people together more. And this is something else that I'm so excited for right now. SolarWinds is opening their doors in ways that they never have before. Several years ago, I was on the East Coast meeting with the second largest credit union in the country. And I sat across the table from the CIO and he said, "Where is SolarWinds?" And I said, "Well, I'm here on their behalf because their model doesn't put people in the field." Well, those days are over, right? And SolarWinds is ready to meet you where you're at. You can get face-to-face conversations with them. You're going to see much more engagement from their executive leadership. And really with Sudhakar as CEO, you've already seen much more engagement from SolarWinds executive leadership. And that's going to continue, and I'm excited for that. So we're a part of that conversation. We're helping to pull those meetings together with our clients and the SolarWinds executive leadership. And this builds on top of what you've had from SolarWinds for decades with their THWAC and the customer success teams. But what I think we're seeing is it's more than just THWAC now, right? THWAC is by far an industry-leading platform for practitioners. But now we're starting to see SolarWinds open up that conversation and include more IT leadership and executive leadership and more face-to-face and in-person opportunities for working with them. And of course, building on top of that is the SolarWinds tools. And so what we've seen them do for years now is go out and acquire best of breed solutions for the various parts of our IT environments where they've always had the network, right? They are today the leading solution for network management, network monitoring, right? But we've seen them make investments into database, right? So SQL Sentry, terrific solution, comes behind the acquisitions of other database technologies that have been DPA and DPM, and now SQL Sentry being added to that. And of course, their cloud investment, right? Pingdom, Papertrail, Loggly, and of course, AppOptics. What we're going to see from them is a more cohesive story, pulling together all of these tools that they've invested in to deliver to you that experience that we're talking about for observability and end-to-end visibility. So best of breed tools still. And then finally, of course, for Loop One, the process of really pulling that all together is what we call Lime, right? It's knowing what your roadmap is by knowing where you've started and where you're going so that you have the ability to not just run the tools and live in a sort of red and green, what's up and what's down world, but in a mature world where you can say, we're using the data from our IT tools to make business decisions and drive outcomes in ways that we haven't before. And we're starting to see this happen in our clients where they're using things like Power BI. Years ago, we saw clients start to use SQL reporting services, and that's evolved into Power BI. But then we're also seeing third-party solutions like Qlik, for example, which is a data analytics tool that people are tying to their Orion database and using it for executive dashboards. So watch this space, right? You're going to see Loop One doing more in the SolarWinds analytics space as we go forward. So why did we build Lime? What does Lime do for an organization? And the easiest way I like to answer that question is it's flexible ITIL, right? I think there's a bit of a lack of standardization in IT operations around the world. And the closest thing we have to closing the gap on that is ITIL. But the reality is ITIL is just too much for a lot of our client organizations. It's more than what we need. It's basically oppressive even. So we need something that lets us as an organization know where we are and what we're doing to get better and where we're trying to go. And that's what Lime is. So if you haven't seen it before, the root of Lime is our grid. This grid basically takes you through the 5 phases of maturity, as well as the 7 technology layers. And it does it in a way that allows you to look in detail at kind of a self-assessment for where you are versus where you're going. And so I'll break this down a little bit more through what we call sort of the 5, 6, 7. The 5 phases of maturity. The 6 assessment areas is how we really get deep on Lime. And of course, we're doing this across the entire technology stack, including cloud, right? You don't see me talk about security in this, and you don't see me talk about cloud in this because they're not add-ons. They're intrinsic, right? When I talk about shared infrastructure, it doesn't matter whether it's on-prem or cloud. It's still shared infrastructure. And when I talk about any part of the technology layers, security is intrinsic to that. Audit, compliance, patching, all of those components have to be built in. So I don't like a model where you have the 7 layers of technology plus security and then the 7 technology layers plus cloud, because to me that makes no sense. That's like saying I'm driving my car down the road plus I have tires somewhere. Like, no, they're just part of the experience. They've got to be integrated and integral, intrinsic. So quickly, the 5 phases of maturity range from ad hoc to insightful. And the themes you can see for ad hoc, the theme is risk, and it means generally a lack of visibility. This is why we love our partnership with Runecast, because Runecast brings visibility to VMware vulnerabilities, as well as being able to audit your Kubernetes, Amazon, and Azure environments and gain visibility where you probably don't have it right now. There's not much in the industry in terms of that has the functionality that Runecast has, so it closes a gap for a lot of organizations where we would have rated them as being at risk in a virtual environment, and they can probably move, closer to optimized. The theme of fragmented is siloed, right? And I think sometimes silos get a bad rap, but the reality is silos are good. Silos represent expertise and depth of knowledge, and they also represent strength of understanding, right? And so you got grain silos and missile silos, and there are good silos in the world, things that we need silos for. But what we want our silos to be in an IT operations context is connected. We want fully meshed silos, right? We want people sharing information and communicating. Now, what that oftentimes leads to in our next phase of maturity here is a typical setting where you have a lot going on and it's really more noise than quality. You've got a lot of tools, you've got a lot of money invested, and you're not getting the outcomes that you want. You still have gaps in compliance and remediation. You're getting alert fatigue. There's a lack of correlated information, and you're trying to battle through that through different integrations and techniques for getting your teams communicating. And that's what we're here to help with, right? Because what we want to do is help you move into an optimized world where correlation is the theme, and the data coming out of your tools is much more easily correlated. Meaningful integrations exist. I mean, the simple ones, things like integrating with your ticketing system. LoopOne is the largest integrator, as far as I know, of ServiceNow to SolarWinds in the world. I think we have the most expertise integrating ServiceNow to SolarWinds than anybody else on the planet. And because it's one that we do all the time, and it's one that should just be an obvious one in terms of integrating your tools with your ticketing systems for incident management. Where we're really driving the conversation and what we want to see happening going forward is more data analytics, using tools like Qlik, using tools like Power BI to really understand the data in our IT tools, be able to trust the data from our IT tools, and then use that data to make business decisions going forward. And so that's really what we end up doing as we drive through what we call our 6 maturity assessment areas. And I'm going really, really quickly through this Lime content because that's not so much the intent of this session. So I'm going to highlight these 6 assessment areas quickly, and then we're going to move towards a wrap up. So the first assessment area is what we call adoption and enablement. And this is all about stakeholders, right? Who's using the solutions and what are they using them for? We very quickly move into what we call feature awareness in an effort to be feature complete, because what we learn almost immediately is that our stakeholders aren't doing all of the things that they could be doing because they don't know what's possible. So there's an education that needs to take place. And this is a big part of what we're doing from a LoopOne perspective to help the stakeholders understand what's possible. What could I get from my tools that I'm not getting today? Or how can I better integrate? Or what are tools that I haven't deployed so that I could get integrations where today I've maybe got 5 tools to try and get some information. I can centralize into a SolarWinds stack, get the same information, but have automated correlation and improve the way that things are working for me. That drives us into what are we collecting so that we can build a foundation for analytics. So it's not just making sure our tools are running well. That's obviously going to be a day-to-day part of performance and availability, but also what are we collecting? What metrics are we collecting? What's going into our repositories so that when it comes time for data analytics, we can actually make meaningful decisions using that data. We're going to do this, of course, in an intrinsically secure way, right? We're going to not only secure our platforms, right? Moving on from the days where we're no longer talking about the Sunburst event, but just using a secure platform day to day, and then using the security features of the platform. it boggles my mind the number of clients we meet that don't know that Network Configuration Manager has a policy compliance capability, that aren't using the CVE capabilities of NCM, that aren't using the end of life, end of support capabilities of NCM. And all of those things feed into a configuration security and an operational security context. And it goes beyond that. There's tools like SCM that I think people are familiar with that can lead to better operational security. But then there's tools that people aren't using, like ARM. I don't think the client base in North America for Access Rights Manager is nearly what it could be and will be in the future, as well as SCM, which is Server Configuration Manager, that has really powerful capabilities that complement and extend what NCM can do in the network, SCM can do for servers. So we're going to be driving that configuration and operational security conversation through Lime. And then, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, automation and integration, right? Everybody's talking about AI, and AI ops is making steady progress in terms of really making AI valuable. We're moving out of sort of that buzz phase and into a more practical phase, I think. But for us, AI has always been automation and integration. Are you familiar with the Orion SDK? Are you leveraging the Orion SDK? Are you integrating not just with your ticketing systems, but with other systems to drive value out of your tools? And that's what this final section is all about, right? Those outcomes. How are you driving value out of your tools, being able to do data analytics and create the outcomes that you're looking for? So let's wrap up there. The last slide here talks about all of the different products that SolarWinds sells that help drive this conversation around monitoring and observability. This is another one of those areas where we often hear people say, I didn't know SolarWinds could do that. And so we're helping to bridge that gap and bring more of these tools to bear in terms of consolidating tools inside your inside your organization, but doing it in a way where you've got all the visibility you need, fewer vendors, likely fewer tools, and better outcomes. So that brings us to nearly the end of our session here. So we'll talk a little bit about ways you can get started if you're looking for help from Loop One. One of the easiest ways to get started is what we call our Rapid Report Card. It's a free, no cost, 2-hour session where we will take a look at your environment with you and give you a quick grade of where your environment is at. What are the obvious things that could be improved upon, recommendations, all at no cost. If you really want to deep dive in a full detailed report, we offer our health check services. And then if you're looking for full proactive managed services of your Orion environment, that's what we call our ITOM Lite and ITOM Plus offerings, where we use our 24/7 secure NOC to provide proactive management of your environment on your behalf and in partnership with your team. And of course, then we also break out from there. We can do project-based services through our professional services offer. And then we also have a smaller reactive version of our managed services where you can simply call us when you want additional expert support that's beyond break-fix support, right? For your break-fix support, you're always going to be leveraging SolarWinds. Through Loop One, you can outsource both break-fix and managed services. So that brings us to the conclusion of our webinar. I want to go ahead and open it up for questions. So let me go pull up our chat view here and see if we've got any questions to answer. Nothing yet?
I've not seen anything come in as yet, Bill.
Okay. Well, I appreciate everybody attending today. If you do have questions, I realize there's a bit rapid fire through the Lime portion there, but thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. And I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out to me via email and share with me your thoughts around observability. What are you seeing? What are you thinking? And what are your opinions on kind of where the industry is going for traditional monitoring, as well as the more sort of recent evolution of the use of the word observability. So with that, I think we can go ahead and wrap up. Thank you, Helen.
Yep, just one real quick one. Actually, someone just asked, will they get a recording of the session? Yes, you will. So that'll get sent out in the next 24 to 48 hours. Fantastic.
Right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.